Well, greetings. On behalf of Wesley Seminary, I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us today for Should a Leader Use the Deplorable Word? Wisdom from C.S. Lewis on Dark Leadership, presented by Dr. Aaron Perry. This event is part of the Wesley Seminary webinar series with the goal of resourcing the local church. At Wesley Seminary, we offer a Master of Arts in Ministry with 13 specializations and a Master of Divinity degree with 12 specializations. Both of these degrees can be completed 100% online and can be completed in either English or Spanish. Our Doctor of Ministry program offers 3 areas of concentration as well as an individualized course of study. And we would love to answer any questions that you might have about any of these programs. If you'd want to call us at 877-673-0009, again, 877-673-0009, or email us at wesley@endwest.edu. Now, during today's webinar, if you should have any questions, please post those in the Q&A forum. I will be monitoring those, and Dr. Perry will answer as many as time allows after his presentation today. Now, Dr. Aaron Perry is Associate Professor of Pastoral Theology and Leadership at Wesley Seminary, where he has served since 2016. He and his wife Heather have 3 children, and they are expecting their 4th in December. Aaron loves the local church and pastors, and he is grateful to God for them both. Now, Aaron received his bachelor's degree from Kingswood University, his master's degree from Asbury Seminary, and his PhD from Regent University. It is my honor to introduce to you today a pastor, an author, a scholar, and my favorite Canadian, Dr. Aaron Perry.
Hey, thanks, Joel. Thanks for the quick caveat as well about us expecting our 4th child. If I happen to end this quickly, everybody will understand. One of the questions that came to me early on in producing this webinar was, well, what is the deplorable word? So to make sure that everybody has some context for it, let me read to you from what is one of my favorite C.S. Lewis stories, The Magician's Nephew. You might think of this as story time with Aaron for the next few moments. Here's how the story goes. This is the Empress Jadis saying this. Even after the war had begun, there was a solemn promise that neither side would use magic. But when she broke her promise, what could I do? Fool! As if she did not know that I had more magic than she. She even knew that I had the secret of the deplorable word. Did she think, she was always a weakling, that I would not use it? What you've just heard is the account of one sister about another. One has been reigning as queen, and she has been challenged by her younger, weaker sister. Well, what was the deplorable word? Said Diggory. Ah, that was the secret of secrets. It had long been known to the great kings of our race that there was a word which, if spoken with the proper ceremonies, would destroy all living things except the one who spoke it. But the ancient kings were weak and soft-hearted, and bound themselves and all who should come after them with great oaths, never even to seek after knowledge of that word. But I learned it in a secret place and paid a terrible price to learn it. I did not use it until she forced me to it. I fought to overcome her by every other means. I poured out the blood of my armies like water. Beast, muttered Polly. The last great battle, said the queen, raged for 3 days here in Charn itself. For 3 days I looked down upon it from this very spot. I did not use my power till the last of my soldiers had fallen, and she, my accursed sister, at the head of her rebels, was halfway up those great stairs that led up from the city to the terrace. Then I waited till we were so close that we could see one another's faces. She flashed her horrible, wicked eyes upon me and said, "Victory." Yes, said I, victory, but not yours. Then I spoke the deplorable word. A moment later, I was the only living thing beneath the sun. The deplorable word, and we're never told exactly what that word is. I suppose it would take us great attention and for us to pay a terrible price to find out what it might be in our own world, is what's used by Queen Jadis, the Empress Jadis, to attain victory. It sets her above everyone else in the entire realm. She pours out the blood of her enemies. She pours out the blood of her own forces. She stops all life, preserving only her own with that word. In today's session, I want to talk to us about maybe not the deplorable word itself, but times when we might be tempted, when we might be encouraged, when we might give ourselves permission to act as leaders in a way that we simply know isn't how we should, or how we might become attuned to such ways of leading so that we never do. In this session, I want to talk about what in the literature of leadership has been called dark leadership. I want to talk about how Lewis shows dark leadership, or how such leadership shows up in his stories. And then I want to see if there's any wisdom we might take from C.S. Lewis. So let's start us off. What is dark leadership? Think about a person that you think is a remarkable leader. Now, it could be that you have some nuance to this. It could also be that you have come to mind one of those people who's simply larger than life, right? A person who it seems that they had influence from the moment that they were born. As a child, they were able to organize and gain a following, and those skills and capacities and that gift seem to carry on into an adult. Now, there's a kind of leadership called charismatic leadership, which does recognize that leadership is a gift. It seems to be an attribution, maybe, of followers to the leader, where we ascribe that this is a person who has leadership ability, and we just naturally follow them. Charismatic leadership can also be seen as kind of a confluence of different forces, or a confluence of different moments where a setting and an opportunity and a problem and a set of followers all kind of come together and give a person authority over them, or a person rises in the midst of a challenge. And sometimes charismatic leadership might even be considered a gift from God. Now, what dark leadership is, with the charismatic leadership in mind, is rather than just confidence, which leaders always have, is a kind of grandiosity, right? A way of setting themselves above. You heard how the witch described this, that she was above all the others. She was willing to use others for her own ends. And connected with that, there might be a willingness not just to risk, but to risk without caution. There might also be a shift that the charismatic leader, who might be seen in a critical context, an opportunity is given for leadership to arise, but there might be a kind of dark leadership that simply acts without thinking whatsoever. There's no critical thinking. There's just simply a use of power or an abuse of gift. Finally, if charismatic leadership is seen in a person's ability to get things done, or a measure of success, dark leadership might be seen when there is no succession. Let me try to picture it like this. Up the left side of the axis is the level of another person's performance, or the follower's performance. And you see how over time it's increased. At the bottom is this marker of when the leader has come, when the leader has started to give influence. And during their time, during their tenure, you see that the follower's performance has increased. One mark of dark leadership might be that when the leader departs, well, so does the other person's performance. It starts to decline. There's success, but there was no succession. Or there was success during the leader's tenure, but there was no success for their followers afterwards. Now, this might be reveal a few aspects of dark leadership. One, there might be overdependence on the leader. Rather than things continuing on an upward trajectory, things have decreased. Followers' performance has gone downhill. Maybe there was overdependence. Maybe the confidence of followers was tied to the leader. It wasn't developed internally or passed on to them. Maybe they weren't properly trained, or systems were idiosyncratic and structures were idiosyncratic, all revolving around the leader's own strengths rather than the organization's or the team's strengths and abilities and mission. Finally, oftentimes, whenever there is dark leadership, there are people who rally to the leader as great friends, but the dark leader also has the tendency to make very staunch foes. In that case, if this is an organizational setting or a team setting and those foes have stuck around, there might be unresolved conflict, and there might be unnecessary conflict and internal conflict after the leader leaves. Those who are left behind in the organization or the team might face difficult challenges. There was success for a time, but there was no good succession. This is one angle of considering dark leadership. Another way is to consider it kind of a parody of transformational leadership. So if the first slide we talked about charismatic leadership, leadership as a gift, transformational leadership is related, but it also recognizes that there are some things leaders can do to develop in skills and capacities. Now, I won't go into transformational leadership in depth here. You can do an internet search and find some information readily on it, I want to show how this is just, or I want you to know that dark leadership is sometimes considered as pariah or as the pseudo transformational leadership. So rather than the leader being one who is a model to all their followers, they become somebody who is inconsistent, but their inconsistencies are kind of excused. You might have somebody who, rather than motivating followers, is willing to use manipulation. They're willing to bend the truth or tell a story. They're willing to skew or spin things to their purpose and advantage. Rather than reasoning and engaging in thoughtful, critical dialogue with followers, winning them over rationally, they are willing to use power and try to convince through strength. Finally, rather than being focused on the other, the pseudo-transformational leadership may present themselves as the exception, the one who is the focus of attention, an exceptional person who deserves exceptional consideration. You heard Empress Jadis with that kind of approach as well. Final way that dark leadership has been used in the literature of leadership is around what's been called the dark triad. Now, you've already heard me describe some of these things, so really this is kind of a summary. But there's ways that dark leadership has been considered when leaders have been Machiavellian or willing to use manipulation, right? They're cunning. They're willing to spin and skew for their own advantage. Dark leadership is one that's marked by psychopathic behavior. People who are attached to the thrill, right? They might become addicted to things like adrenaline or risk or the rush that comes about in different aspects that they are leading or different projects that they are leading. And accompanied with that is they have little sense of anxiety or even empathy to those who might not enjoy the thrill quite so much. Finally, the sense of narcissism or a kind of superiority over their followers. Now, with all this description, you might say, why in the world would there be such a thing as dark leadership? Why would we put up with it? Why wouldn't people say, hey, this is wrong, or hey, this can be done better, or what in the world is this about? Now, there's a few reasons that there might be appeals, or there might be an appeal to dark leadership. There's a reason that this can be studied because it's prevalent enough. Number one, people who engage in dark leadership also often make very clear claims. They're not ones who are engaged in nuance or complexity. They make very clear claims and as a result can obtain followings. Number two, they often offer security and safety in the midst of danger. Number three, they can bring order in the midst of chaos. Now you see how some of these things might actually not just be attractive, but actual goods. Right? There's times whenever people who engage in dark leadership can, perhaps unwittingly, achieve good ends. Order and safety and security and clarity are all good things, but we have to make sure that they are afforded and according to reality, obtained and presented in fair and just ways. So I don't want to paint dark leadership as this very obvious thing to see. At times, it's difficult to see when it's happening. At times, there's an appeal to it that we might not recognize. One of the reasons that I would encourage you as a leader is that as a leader to read fiction is because fiction often has an ability to paint for us nuance. It has an ability to take us deep into characters, to show their complexity, to show why some characters might have an appeal in a story, even if we recognize that they are not good people to follow. One of the most amazing findings that I found in dark leadership was this kind of ironic justification. Rothman and Kolar found that people consider Machiavellian and psychopathic traits, so that ability to use cunning or to skew and to spin psychopathy, this attraction to the rush without feeling anxiety or empathy, they considered these traits and actions less desirable for themselves than for others, but people also believed that the effects of these traits and actions are more grievous when other people exhibited them and took those kinds of actions. In other words, people are less likely to desire these traits and actions, but if they need to lead in these ways, it won't be as bad. Do you hear how the appeal to dark leadership might even be sinister and cunning within ourselves? Other people desire this more than I do, but if I need to act in this way, the effects just won't be as bad than if they did it. How does Lewis start to complicate or illuminate this situation? How do we see dark leadership in C.S. Lewis? In this section, I want to go through three aspects of it: the character, of dark leadership, or where we might be attuned to see it in Lewis's fiction. Context, where does it grow? How does it spring up? And then number 3, what's its conclusion in Lewis's story? Number 1, and this has already been seen in the literature, grandiosity, right? You heard the Empress Jadis in the quote that we read from Lewis early on. This is a picture of Uncle Andrew, a character also found in The Magician's Nephew. Uncle Andrew has this line. He says, "Ours, my boy, is a high and lonely destiny." He's talking about the exception, or the exceptional leader who is the exception. His nephew Diggory has just told him why he shouldn't tell lies and why he should tell the truth. And Uncle Andrew recognizes, yes, this is a good rule for most people, perhaps for slaves or for children or for women, he says, but not for him. Ours, he says, is a high and lonely destiny. Dark leadership in Lewis is marked by grandiosity. It's also marked by rhetorical manipulation, or as we've heard, Machiavellianism in the literature. This is a picture of Shift. If I can say, he is the most hated character that I have in all the Chronicles of Narnia. I hate Shift more even than I hate the White Witch, because he is so pathetic. He doesn't have power. All he has are words. And they are words that he uses to use people, even one who's supposed to be his friend. Shift has a friend named Puzzle. Puzzle is not very bright. Puzzle is most willing to follow. And Puzzle is often used by Shift to his own ends. And one of the reasons that Shift is so cunning is because he's able to turn his own duplicitous behavior, he's able to turn his own skewed character and pretend that it's really about Puzzle, that Puzzle's the one who has a skewed character. Shift says this in one of the stories, in the story of The Last Battle. "Really, Puzzle, I didn't think you'd ever say a thing like that. I didn't think it of you, really." This comes after Puzzle has very slightly challenged one of the requests, enormous and irresponsible, that Shift has made of him, and Shift turns it back. And you might think about this in leaders. Leaders are, dark leadership is one of those, people who exhibit dark leadership often use this kind of rhetorical manipulation, make their problems about the other people, make their shortcomings about the shortcomings of other people, make their skewed expectations about the skewed expectations of other people. This is one of the things that Shift does and that we've seen in the literature of dark leadership. Now, this is a bit of a new one from Lewis. One of the things that marks different characters who would exhibit Machiavellianism or narcissism in Lewis's stories is what he calls a deficiently practical mind. In The Horse and His Boy, one of these characters is Arshish. Arshish has this deficiently practical mind, says Lewis. It's also exhibited by Shift. It's also exhibited by this character here. This is Edmund, just after he has left his friends, his family, at Mr. and Mrs. Beaver's house to betray them to the White Witch. On his journey, he's slogging through the snow, and it's a very difficult journey. And one of the things that Edmund says is this: "When I'm king of Narnia, the first thing will be to make some decent roads." This deficiently practical mind. Now, it's important to keep the adjective deficient, because Lewis is not against practicality. He often praises characters for being able to think practically. In fact, Mrs. Beaver is a very practical character, and she's praised for it. But it's a sense of deficient practicality. It's an over-concern with efficiency or expediency or practicality. It's an over-concern with these things as opposed to things like story or the weather or simply enjoying being with another person, or enjoying the setting where one finds oneself. We also see this trait, or this description of dark leadership in Lewis's fiction, is this kind of unjust justice. This kind of not complete disregard for justice, but a willingness to obtain justice in different ways, or a willingness to obtain justice in ways that are wrong. I call this unjust justice. The picture here is of the White Witch as she is about to kill Aslan. And of course, this is happening at the stone table, and Aslan's life is being offered for the sake of Edmund. The innocent is being given on behalf or in place of the guilty. Unjust justice is about taking just acts without a just context, or unjust actions in a context of justice. This scene is one that's incredibly intricate, actually, in the story, because whenever Edmund is taken by the White Witch, she and her slave, the dwarf, are discussing what they ought to do with him. They wonder if they should hold him as a hostage. Finally, they decide that they should kill him. But the problem is, as the queen says, this should take place at the stone table. That's the place to execute such justice. But they recognize that the stone table is currently being held by Aslan and won't be able to be used. So they decide to take a just action, the execution of a traitor, but they don't care the context. They will do it in private, and he is tied. The symbolism, incredibly powerful for Lewis. Edmund is tied to a tree, and there he is going to be killed. Of course, Edmund is rescued and the story unfolds, and Aslan is given on behalf of Edmund. And now you have a complete shift. You have an unjust action, the life of an innocent being taken instead of the life of the guilty, even though it's being taken in the just context at the stone table. Unjust justice is a mark of dark leadership in Lewis's fiction. So where does it grow? What's the setting in which dark leadership takes place? Here's a few places in it. Dark leadership grows in bureaucratic complexity and power differential. The character who perhaps most clearly exhibits this in the Chronicles of Narnia is Governor Gumpus of the Lone Isles. Narnia and its authorities haven't visited the area in a while, and they find that it's incredibly well ordered, but unjust. Gumpus talks about minutes, motions, correspondence, and commissions, and yet he doesn't care about the slave trade that's happening as an intricate part, he says, of the economy of the Lone Isles. Dark leadership grows in that kind of complexity and bureaucratic structure. Perhaps the most clear example from the Space Trilogy, or the Cosmic Trilogy, is of the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments, or the NICE. One of the characters, Feverstone, who is deeply intrigued by the NICE, remarks that it has 15 sub-directors. Bureaucratic complexity gives a potential for dark leadership to grow. This one kind of caught me by surprise as I was going through Lewis's literature with dark leadership in mind. Dark leadership also grows in young authority. There's a sense that Caspian is incredibly grandiose. You recall that he has taken this vow to sail to the ends of the world to rescue all of his father's loyal subjects who left whenever his uncle Miraz took over. And yet Caspian, with this grandiose claim, can't remember one of their names over and again. You also have Rillian's youth and impetuosity. He wants to achieve justice for his mother who has been killed, and yet it consistently leaves him distracted, and he eventually, quite quickly actually, grows bored almost, and is lured away from this mission. Final example of dark leadership growing in the midst of youth is of Tyrion. And here Lewis makes a really interesting contrast. He describes Tyrion, who's the final king of Narnia, with broad shoulders and strong limbs, but says that his face, or his beard, was still scanty. This is a reflection of this kind of duality, this strong strength, broad shoulders, strong limbs, but a face that is still quite young. And in Lewis's literature, the face often stands in to reveal a person's character. So there's a not yet formed character that Tyrion has. And we see that part of his dark leadership shows up whenever he and his companion Jewel the unicorn take the lives of enemy soldiers without first warning them or defying them. Dark leadership grows in the midst of young authority. We also see that dark leadership thrives in the absence or abdication of leadership. Once again, this is illustrated by Tyrion's absence from Cair Paravel. It says he's often absent, often wandering or being away from his responsibility. And one of the things that grows up in the midst of Tyrion's leadership is this lack of recognition for what Aslan is really like, who Aslan truly is, and what he is, the kind of character that he really is. This is a picture of Puzzle with the lion suit on, and Shift there to the right is reflecting kind of his presence in the background, that he's convinced Puzzle to put this lion skin on so that they can have this way in Narnia to see it achieve great economic ends. He actually uses it for an opportunity to connect with the Calormans and those who are in Tashbaan. It's a tremendous foil, or it's a tremendous trick that they play on the Narnians. But one of the reasons the Narnians can't recognize it for what it is they don't know who Aslan really is. One of the famous lines that Lewis has from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is that Aslan is not a tame lion. And this is a refrain that's used over and over again in the last battle, but hardly ever is it used correctly. People are familiar with the teaching, but they don't use it correctly. In fact, it's used whenever they say, why would Aslan require the felling of good trees? And they say, well, he's not a tame lion, is he? And they recognize, well, would Aslan ever want talking animals enslaved? And they say, well, he's not a tame lion, is he? This opportunity for dark leadership, this manipulation and Machiavellianism and narcissism that grows and is seen in Shift happens because there's been an abdication of leadership. So where does it lead? How does Lewis tell the story in the conclusion of dark leadership? First thing he wants us to know is that dark leadership brings about death, destruction, and preservation of the status quo, but it does not create. Let me take you back to the deplorable word. The deplorable word is presented in deep contrast to Aslan's singing in The Magician's Nephew. We are introduced to the White Witch as one who uses the deplorable word, and she has the ability to do tremendous harm, but she does not have the ability to make things grow. Think about her reign in Narnia. It's always winter, never Christmas. It's always winter. Nothing grows in winter. One of the things that Lewis says that the Empress Jadis, or the White Witch, is able to do is she's able to blast things, and she reduces high and heavy doors to dust. It says that she hurls Aunt Letty across the room when she realizes she can't turn Aunt Letty to dust. In London, Diggory thinks that he's going to find the White Witch, or the Empress Jadis, to have reduced policemen to dust. Now, this phrase dust is incredibly important because you'll recognize that this is exactly what God used to create, right? God brought man from the dust of the ground. The White Witch's power, or the power of the deplorable word, really is only to bring things to dust. In contrast, it's Aslan who brings fruitful life and flourishing with his singing words. Dark leadership might be powerful, but in the end, it only brings death, destruction, and a preservation of the status quo. The owls say that the White Witch bound their land for 100 years in the silver chair. The White Witch is able to preserve this status quo, but nothing grows. There's no expansion or growth or fruit or flourishing. Lewis also shows at the end of dark leadership, or where dark leadership leads, is to ironic justice. This is a picture of Uncle Andrew. You'll recall that he was one of the initial characters that we described, one who was grandiose. Lewis is willing to use animals and children for his own purposes because he thinks he is such an exceptional character, such an exceptional person. Well, in this setting, you have Andrew who's been kind of encaged by animals. He was one who used animals to his ends, and now they don't know what he is, and so they put him in a cage. They don't recognize that he is one who can communicate with them. They would talk to him, but he can only hear growls because his character is so misformed. One of the things that Diggory warns Uncle Andrew of earlier in the story comes to be. Diggory says this, "Well, I've never heard a story in which people of that bullying sort weren't paid out in the end, and I bet you will be, and serve you right." Of all the things that Diggory said, this was the first that really went home to Andrew. Dark leadership is a precursor to ironic justice. In other words, justice does come in a fitting way in the midst of dark leadership. So, how might we attend to dark leadership? How might we achieve some warnings of this so that we are skewed away or turned away from it, and so that we're maybe aware and can turn away from it even if we were not intentionally trying to lead in these manipulative ways? In his book, Out of the Silent Planet, one of the Lewis describes the character of Weston, who is one who has gone to another planet in order to see how it might be taken and brought under the authority and reign of human beings so it can be essentially plundered and put to humanity's ends and purposes. Of course, this character Weston comes into the presence of an Oyarsa. It's kind of like an angelic overseer of the planet. And this is what the Oyarsa says to Weston. He says, "Let me see if there is anything in your mind but fear and death and desire." Now, these three kind of form a skewed or a pseudo reflection of the theological virtues. Fear is a parody of faith, and death is a parody of hope. Desire is a parody of love. We can achieve wisdom from Lewis by kind of attending to these things in ourselves. Do we see fear or death or desire raising up in us? Is this the character that's being formed in us? Lewis makes this warning explicit in The Magician's Nephew. Near the end of the story, after the White Witch has been settled for now, and she will be kept at bay from Narnia for a long season, Polly and Diggory are about to be sent back to their own world, and they have this conversation with Aslan. They're in what's called a wood between the worlds. Just before they're sent back to their own world, Aslan uses this as a teachable moment for them. Follow the dialogue. "When you were last here," said Aslan, "that hollow was a pool. And when you jumped into it, you came to the world where a dying sun shone over the ruins of Charn. There is no pool now. That world has ended, as if it had never been. Let the race of Adam and Eve take warning." "Yes, Aslan," said both children, but Polly added, "But we're not quite as bad as that world, the world of Jadis. Are we, Aslan?" "Not yet, daughter of Eve," he said, "not yet. But you are growing more like it. It is not certain that some wicked one of your race will not find out a secret as evil as the deplorable word and use it to destroy all living things. And soon, very soon, before you are an old man and an old woman, great nations in your world will be ruled by tyrants who care no more for joy and justice and mercy than the Empress Jadis. Let your world beware. That is the warning." Weston was put under the microscope by the Oyarsa of Malacandra. The Oyarsa was looking to see, was there anything more than fear and death and desire that is driving this individual? And Aslan makes this warning to us as well. We are tempted to take reality and use it to our own ends. We are tempted to lead in these kinds of dark ways. We are tempted to use secrets like the deplorable word to achieve our own ends, to preserve our own status quo, to preserve what we think is best only for us. We are tempted to act in such exceptional ways. One of the things that Lewis would give to us then is this soft but firm encouragement to pay humble attention to ourselves and the structures that we build around us. Pay humble attention to the selves that we are forming and the structures that we inhabit. So let me offer you a few reflexive questions. These are questions that are to help you not just think, but also to look into the world, to look into yourself, to look into the world that's been crafted around you, and to see how they might illuminate where there might be elements of dark leadership for you, so that you can come against them, so that you can react appropriately. Number one, consider this. Have I fostered a peer relationship with a colleague who also reports to me? Or is there a follower in your setting that has permission to speak with you in frank and honest ways? Can they give you unthreatening feedback? Have you trained them to do so? I recall one time I was in a peer relationship with a person who is a leader of mine, and they had asked me to give them feedback, but they didn't train me on how to do that well. It made for some very awkward conversations until I realized, okay, this is not the kind of feedback they were looking for. This is not the way to give it to them. You might follow this up. If you are in a position of a follower in an organization or on a team, you might ask the implication or the question this way. Have you fostered a peer relationship with a leader? Have you learned how to give her or him feedback that they don't consider threatening? Paying humble attention to ourselves and humble attention to our structures requires us to recognize that subordinates often know the leader's tendencies better than the leader. Diggory's warning to Uncle Andrew actually would have been something that was quite gracious to him if he had have attended it. If Uncle Andrew hadn't have been threatened by it, but instead have had the character to listen to Diggory, to listen to his nephew, then he would have avoided quite a bit of the wrong-headed behavior that he took. Second reflexive question for you. When are you most tempted to rely on your gifts of leadership rather than doing the hard work of leadership? Are there times in your leadership that you know that you could do a little bit more work in order to obtain more evidence and to speak more critically and be critically engaging to inform and convince maybe your board or maybe a follower, maybe your team? But instead you rely simply on the gift, maybe a gift of rhetoric or a gift of strength and being able to use power. When are you most tempted to rely on your gifts of leadership rather than doing the hard work of leadership? Here's the truth. Seasons come and go, but character comes out in winter. Seasons of leadership come and go, but character comes out in winter. You recall the White Witch's leadership in Narnia was marked by always winter, never Christmas. Nothing grew in that time. The fact is there are some seasons in our lives that really is a winter where we're doing hard work of leadership, but nothing really seems to be growing. In those times, our character might come out. And be mindful of it. Attend to it. When is the winter in your leadership? And how can you make sure that you're not leading in ways that are marked by your own exceptionalism or manipulation or narcissism? I also say it like this. Don't defend winter. Maybe it's a wintry season in your organization or your team, but it's one in which you're actually doing quite well, right? You feel like you're leading well and you're helping set them up. You're leading well in a tough season. I say it like this. Don't defend winter. When things start to thaw and ground starts to become soft so that things can grow again, it looks like it's a season of fruitfulness. Don't keep things stuck. Have the courage to see how you might be able not to keep things bound up with you, but how you can see them go on into a new era and into a new season. There are many people that God gives to us in times of crises and critical situations, and it's like their leadership is poised just for that time, and often it is. You might call them a wartime leader. The trouble with wartime leaders is that they often see things as wartime, and it's tough for them to lead in the midst of peace. Seasons come and go. Character comes out in winter. What character comes out in you in the wintry seasons? If you do well leading in winter, do you have the character to see things move along from it so that you don't defend it and keep things stuck there? Third reflexive question. When's the last time you reviewed the leadership structure around you? Maybe your family, your church, or organization team? Is the leadership structure masking injustice with efficiency, right? Lots of things are happening, but beneath the surface, things aren't as strong as they could be. Or some people are being ignored or forgotten because other things are humming right along. Is the leadership structure a maze of ambiguity, right? You recall the description or the diagram that had the incredibly complicated flow chart. Is the leadership structure around you a maze of ambiguity? Do people know how the organizational structure works? Do they know who to talk to and who is in charge of what? Do they know the information that will help to empower them? In their book, The Leadership Challenge, Barry Kouzes and his co-author Posner talk about the importance of building confidence and building competence in our followers. And one of the ways that we do that is sharing information, helping people to feel comfortable and to know how things work, to give them information as much as we can that helps them to know why decisions are made. Is the leadership structure that you oversee or that you're part of, is it clear or is it a maze of ambiguity? Final one, is the leadership structure mandated only for the compliant? Is the leadership structure only expected of people who will comply with it just by their very nature? Some people will more naturally follow the rules, and an organizational structure will work for them. They'll follow the rules. And then there are other people who struggle against it. If you have two sets of rules, or if you have a structure that is for those who are compliant and you have a structure for those who don't comply, it's this recipe for dark leadership and a setting of injustice. Do an audit. Reflect on the leadership structures, the org structure around you, the systems that are in place to see, do they mask things? Is it a maze? Are they mandated only for some but not for all? The final reflexive question I'd encourage you to think about with dark leadership in mind is, have you attended to the responsibilities of the leaders that you oversee? I call it the performance review from hell. I was young in ministry and I was doing my best to lead in one of the ministries that I oversaw. I was doing a performance review with one of the volunteers in the ministry. It was one of those reviews that was going to be about 90% positive and 10% needed to be formative, let's say. I hadn't really planned to get into that final 10% because I wasn't feeling that it would be a good idea, but some of the subjects came up, and the person whose review we were, the person who was in the performance review wanted to hear what my feedback was around some of the things that he was doing. Unfortunately, it wasn't very flattering. There are things that he needed to change to grow a ministry, to have a constructive ministry, and to be responsible to those that he was leading. But it did not go well. I hadn't planned to have that part of the review, and that was already a setting for some dark leadership to grow up. And as a result, I didn't treat him in the way that he deserved to be treated, as a valuable part of our church and as a person made in God's image. The truth is, I needed to be better prepared. And if you have people in your sphere of influence that you're expecting to do things like give feedback or plan budgets or do performance reviews, take the time to see, do they know how to do these things? Do the leaders on your teams know how to do proactive, corrective, formative reviews of their followers? You recall that the phrase, "he's not a tame lion," grew to be something that was not helpful at all. In fact, it was used to excuse unjust behavior in the last battle. Leaders are teachers. Leaders must be teachers. If there are people in your sphere of influence, if there are people that report to you and they have very key responsibilities, don't take for granted that they know how to do them. Check in with them. See how they might need to be trained. See how they might need to be coached. Even as an educator, I can give a lesson on something, and I should never take for granted that the person has learned just because they've gone through my class. I believe that our education at Wesley Seminary is great, and students leave here and are able to apply what they've learned in ministry. But people all the way through need coaching. We all need opportunities to grow and to be sharpened in our gifts and responsibilities. So take the time. Those who report to you, make sure that they have the abilities and the character to carry out some of these key actions in how they treat their followers. Thanks so much for tuning into this webinar on dark leadership. I hope some of these reflexive questions are beneficial to you, exploring what season you're in, what character comes out, exploring the structures, exploring what deficiencies there might be in some of the skills and capacities of those who report to you. One of the challenges about dark leadership is that it doesn't always it's not always about the intent of a person. Sometimes dark leadership just emerges in the midst of a context, whether it's lack of preparation or high pressure or high expectations with low skills. So the more that you're attended to it, the more that you can be aware of how you can avoid leading in those kinds of ways. Thanks so much for tuning in. Turn things over to Joel for some question and answers that you might, or for some questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. That was fantastic. We do have some questions already, and anyone else that you have a question, now is the time. Go ahead and enter that in our Q&A forum. All right, Aaron, here we go. First question. You discussed the appeals of dark leadership to demonstrate why dark leadership isn't always obvious. What are your thoughts on the use of the dark triad to achieve good purposes, e.g. certainty in complicated times? Are there times it is appropriate to do the wrong things for the right reasons? Does a utilitarian teleological ethic permit or even warrant dark leadership or the use of the elements of the dark triad?
If I'm answering this from myself, I'm tempted to say, boy, it really feels like that, doesn't it? Right? It's tempting to use power without concern all the time. It's tempting to spin things to our advantage. It's tempting to tell partial truths so that people can make what we think are good choices. But what I would say from Lewis is just that warning that Diggory had to his Uncle Andrew, that those who would think they can use these kinds of tools to their ends end up being the ones who are misformed. I would say it like Lewis is very much into virtue ethics. So we make a decision based on the kind of person it will make us, based on the kind of person that we will become. In his book Perelandra, Lewis discusses or presents just such a situation between the character Ransom, who is sent to Perelandra, this world where he's working to keep one of its initial beings from making a wrong choice or from uh, sinning. Essentially, it's a world without a fall, and ransom is sent there to keep it from having a fall. And he tells a little lie, and he tells a lie in order to have her make a good choice. But Lewis describes it like this. He says that in that place it would not do, and it was like the world hurled the lie back at him, and his face, the person who had uttered the lie, was twisted. Anytime we are tempted to lie or to use power for our ends or to use power in ways that are without concern for others, or in thinking that we might just have arrogance or know better, there's always going to be a price to pay. So in the end, if one thinks that they need to do that, I think that it's very important to realize there will always be a price that they pay in the midst of doing so.
Okay, thank you. Okay, another question here. Are there any early warning signs for the inculcation of dark leadership, either in the self or in others?
Oh man, I think the one that I most attend to is lying, right? When am I willing to have somebody believe something that is not quite right in order for me to get my way, or in order for things to be easier for me, or in order for them to make a certain choice, right? If I'm willing for them to have partial information and to be misled, I think that's something to pay very, very, very close attention to in ourselves. I also think it's very important that we engage in critical thinking anytime that we have information that's given to us that's encouraging us to act in certain ways. If we find that information is being used, right, it's being spun or it's being skewed, that's a great clue that those who are in leadership might be not simply be Machiavellian or cunning like that, but they also may have some grandiosity, some inflated views of themselves, and some deflated views of their followers.
Okay, thank you. All right, next question here. Have you discerned characters that respond well to dark leaders over them, such as Jonas and Miraz? What wisdom might some characters demonstrate when a shift from dark leadership is difficult due to habits and when efforts continue to fall back into those habits of dark leadership?
If I understand it right, if I understand the question, is it's asking, are there people who are especially susceptible to dark leadership? And I would say yes. I think people who have either malformed selves. So Uncle Andrew is incredibly taken with the White Witch because he's a malformed character, right? He's not a good person. He's not. He has a misshapen self, and so he's taken up with her and he's enamored with her. At the same time, it's really interesting that Diggory, who is not yet formed as a character, is still kind of taken with her as well. He considers her a dazzling beauty. It's one of the aspects of, I think, Lewis's recognition that girls can sometimes display a maturity more than boys, is that Polly never quite sees her beauty, right? So I would say those who are susceptible to dark leadership are those who have malformed character, or those who are immature, right? Are still sorting out their own selves, right? Are still in process of being formed as a character. As it pertains to after dark leadership, I think that that's whenever you're exploring, well, what's the appropriate amount of responsibility that I can give to a person? One of the amazing things that Lewis consistently tells through the Chronicles of Narnia is that Aslan is rarely doing something overtly, right? Rather, he's creating a context where the human characters are able to take action, right? Where they are to risk. One of the great exchanges between Aslan and Lucy is that in Prince Caspian is that the troop is being guided by Peter, and he's fairly humble in his leadership, but she keeps seeing Aslan, and he wants them to go a different way, but she will speak up, but then she doesn't set off on her own. All right, there's a way that he's consistently encouraging human beings to take action themselves so that they can grow up to be selves. And I would say, if you are a leader who's just inherited a context where it was marked by dark leadership before, right? Maybe habits or practices or an environment, is to pay very close attention to what responsibility you can give to those in that environment so that they have a chance to grow up in themselves, to become stronger character, to grow in their own confidence and their own competence. So I would say, paying close attention to yourself, realizing that dark leadership is really sinister, that we all can be we have to pay attention to ourselves, to where fear, death, and desire is within us. But then at the same time, to work really hard at teaching so that you can build up the character, competence, confidence of those who are following you.
Okay, thank you. All right, this next question comes with a warning at the beginning. This might be a too sensitive topic to touch, but I'll ask anyway. Dark leadership grows in bureaucratic complexity. Does this mean that our nation is running on a basis of creating and promoting dark leaders?
Oh, I would say that any context where people don't know how things get done presents a bureaucratic opportunity for there to be hidden motives. Now the truth is, when Gumpus says that there's nothing in the minutes or the motions or correspondence, um, bureaucracy often gives a great cover for wrong actions and misguided actions as well, because it precisely because it is so ordered, right? So the order can both present complexity, right? It's tough to wade through to see all of what's going on, but it also can present a facade of order, or a pseudo kind of order. So one of the things that I would say is to try to be as informed as possible, right? If you're working in, this is why civics is important, whatever the nation is like just to have a sense of awareness of how do things function, right? What's the responsibility of different positions? And I would say that doesn't just apply to the nation, but that also applies to your workplace, right? Do you have a sense of how your workplace operates so that you can keep an eye on things, right? Do you have a sense of how your local government functions? Do you have a sense of how your home runs? Right? Do you teach your children this is how some of the decisions get made? In the ability, I have 9-year-old, 7-year-old, 4-year-old. They're able to understand at different levels how things get done. The goal is I want to teach them and kind of pull the curtains back, so to speak, so that they have a sense of the machinery of things. But I also think it's important for us to do our own work of being educated on how local government works, federal government works, and the different political machineries that are put to use.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, questions keep coming in here. All right, how can responsible, authentic, and ethical followers resist dark leadership without losing positive, even redemptive aspects of their character? In other words, how does one fight against dark leaders without losing their soul?
Yeah.
Wow.
I would always encourage as much as possible to tell the truth, to be telling the truth to the leader who's above, and recognizing one of the things that Lewis said is that our the way we see things has a great deal to do with where we're standing, right? Our point of view has a great amount to do with where we're standing, and so there's a humility that comes with telling the truth, right? Is if I think the person that I report to is doing something wrong, then I have a responsibility to be humble, to observe and see if that's the case, and then to present that truth humbly. This is what I see. This is what it seems to me. Can we talk about this, right? Now, if that's been taken and other, and it's rejected, then you have to make judgment calls, right? Like there's, we have whistleblowing, right? Depending on the severity of this kind of action, there's a place for going around the leader to perhaps their leader if one has given every good faith to speak to them personally, right? There's different opportunities, but I think the question asker is already well on the way, right? Like, how do we address injustice without becoming unjust creatures ourselves? Because the truth is, we're all tempted into this unjust justice, right? To bring justice in unjust ways and to bring justice in unjust contexts. But I would say being humble and open with the truth and being direct with people and often private with people in as much as possible is a great way to start. Ira Chaleff, I-R-A, first name Chaleff, C-H-A-L-L-E-F, has done a lot of work on followership. And a lot of times it's that second chairperson or it's that third chairperson or down the line that they have to exhibit so much courage because they don't have as much power as others, right? The White Witch has a tremendous amount of power, and Uncle Andrew has more power than Diggory and Polly. But it's amazing how both of them are cowards whenever they see power that's greater than theirs. So the White Witch is terrified of Aslan, right? hurls the iron bar at him that she's torn off in London, and it's what grows up into being the lamppost, right? Digger or Uncle Andrew's terrified whenever he encounters more powerful people than him. But so what I say is, if you're a person who has less power in the organization, it will probably take greater courage, a great amount of courage to speak up and to be humble with it. But chances are you'll probably have more courage than what your leaders actually do if they are behaving intentionally in unjust ways.
Okay, thank you. All right. Dark leadership does not create. Yes. Also, many tools of dark leadership are centered on deception and manipulation of followership. Think Shift and Puzzle or the White Witch and Edmund. How does an emerging awareness of dark leadership reconcile with the followers? In other words, what do we do with the Puzzles and Edmunds of the world?
Yeah, well, I think for Peter's treatment of Edmund was he recognized he shouldn't have been so harsh with him, right? Edmund probably wouldn't have been as likely to betray if his own older brother hadn't have been so harsh on him. So with an Edmund, I think it's consistently relationship, right? How do I help them grow in the midst of growing up into being a strong character? So how do I help teach them, train them to grow in competence and confidence and character? That's a great way to work with the Edmonds. Puzzle's a different character, in part because he's very naive and not bright whatsoever. Many of his things are excused because he's not aware, and he's given to Shift's manipulation. At the same time, there were some things that he knew were wrong, and he could have acted on them. So again, it's the same thing, right? How do I help people live out their best selves, or how do I help them live out to their own abilities, their own best, what they can do, and then be radically optimistic that God is not about leaving people with characters of fear, death, and desire, but actually wants to make them people of faith and hope and love. And anytime you're seeing that grow in a person, you're seeing true reality take root. And so that's what I would say is how can you come alongside people to see them best formed into the likeness and image of our Lord Jesus Christ, if it's that kind of context explicitly, and even if it's a context where it's not explicitly religious like that, it's how can I help to foster maybe the virtues of temperance or fortitude, the cardinal virtues as well.
Wow. Good stuff. Do you have time for 2 more questions?
Sure.
Okay. All right. The witch is dark leadership. Lion is the right leadership. What does the wardrobe represent?
I don't know. I mean, there's a number of let's say Freudian psychoanalysis that takes place with the wardrobe, and I don't necessarily think that's always helpful or not helpful. But I do think there's a place for considering that the children know they need to put on the jackets to go into Narnia, that they know they need something to help keep them safe and warm, and to their credit, they discuss, is this an ethical action, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that there's a part of it that Lewis is telling us, if we are going to be courageous to go into new contexts of being formed as characters, right? If we're going to risk growing and maturing in the best ways, then we need to ask what's the best way to do so, and we're going to need some resources along the way. So that's how I would work with that. I don't know. I haven't thought a whole lot about that, so take that for what it's worth. I think it's a good question. Maybe there's something there, maybe there isn't.
Okay. All right. And last question. Is a characteristic of dark leadership one in which the leadership establishes rules, policies, procedures, legislation, etc., but believe themselves to be above or beyond the reach of these very same rules?
Exceptionalism absolutely is. The forming of order and structure and systems, that's not in itself dark leadership. It's whenever these things become overly complex or are used to not to facilitate an organization's mission, but to hide or to present a pseudo order. That's when it becomes a dark efforts of dark leadership. But the actual developing of order and structure and policy, that in itself is not. There's like a warning that goes along with it. It can be used for it. But the exceptionalism, absolutely, right? Whenever people think that they are the exception to the rules, then yes, there's something there to key in on, that there might be other character faults and maybe sinister motives at play.
Wow. Thank you. Great Q&A session. Wow. No, I'm not surprised. This webinar, we received more questions ahead of time just because of the title, I think. So it was very provocative. Great job. Great session there.
If I might say, I'd be happy if other questions that people weren't able to ask, I'd be happy to receive those by email. It might take me a few days to respond to all of them, but if there's any questions that people had, I'd be delighted to have further interaction with them.
Fantastic. Yeah, send those to aaron.perry@endwest.edu, or you can send them to me, joel.hunt@endwest.edu, and I'll send those to Dr. Perry. So thank you very much. I'd like to kind of wrap this session up with thank yous. One, to Wesley Seminary for hosting today's event. Two, to Dr. Perry for an excellent presentation. Thank you very much for your time. And most importantly, to you. Thank you very much for watching. You're the reason that we're doing these. So we're very thankful that you spent your time and joined us today. So, and in that same vein, please fill out the survey that you will be receiving as you sign off today. As a reward, we're going to give away 3 of these new Wesley Seminary t-shirts. We will draw winners at random, so please fill out your surveys. The reason for those surveys, we're just trying to improve your experience. Hopefully you're seeing that we are reading those and trying to implement the things that you're recommending. And one of those things each time has been an extended time of Q&A. So thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope that you'll take your time again today to fill out that survey. Again, if you have any feelings that you're on the fence or you're feeling that call towards seminary, please get in contact with our enrollment team at 877-673-0009, or email us at wesley@endwest.edu, or call me, text me, email me or Dr. Perry, and we'll get the information sent to the right people. We'd love to answer any questions that you have and help you get started on that path. So thank you again for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And remember, we are Wesley, and you belong here. Blessings. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Perry.
Welcome. Thanks, Joel. Bye, everybody.